Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game Podcast. And today we're with Kathleen. But Kathleen, are you prepared to engage?
All systems are loaded, Captain.
Let's do this. Because Kathleen, M-A-T, has been teaching gifted middle school students for 15 years using design thinking to create functional art, from designing tabletop games and RPGs to filmmaking, cosplay, and so much more. She shares all of her game design teaching resources at KathleenMercury.com for free and loves to collaborate with educators and industry leaders to promote game design curriculum at every level and format. She currently also co-hosts the podcast Games in Schools and Libraries and On Board Games, and is a frequent guest on other podcasts. She has multiple games in various stages of design, development, and publication, with the upcoming titles Grease Lightning from WizKids and Dragnarok from Colossal. Kathleen thinks happiness comes from being able to create the life you want, and she feels very fortunate that she's been able to do that. So Kathleen, is there anything we're missing from that intro?
I mean, that really kind of covers it. I am on a GAMA board on the Education Advisory Committee as far as looking at games and education and how GAMA can best develop content and support for developing educational programs in schools and libraries as it relates to games. And that's an interesting sort of challenge right now. That's, I guess, one more thing, I guess, if you want to add as far as like resume goes, but it's a whole other way of looking at what we do, because especially coming at it from like the industry standpoint, that, you know, sort of corporate sort of standpoint, which normally in public education, we don't really have that approach. So that's kind of another interesting little problem to solve as it relates to how can we make games a meaningful part of the classroom.
Absolutely. It is a very, very meaningful conversation, and it is a conversation we like to have every now and then here on this podcast as well. So, Kathleen, you do many things. You're involved in many things. We were talking in the pre-interview. You have your time completely maxed out in many ways. So, we would like to know, as myself and the engagers, the audience, we would like to know, what does a day with Kathleen look like? If we were to follow you for a day or a day of the week or a day of the weekend, whatever you want to go for, what would that look like? What are you doing regularly?
Well, it's funny because obviously right now, you know, COVID changes everything. But generally speaking, for me as a teacher, so much of what I do centers around teaching and my students. As far as a general day goes, I used to work out every morning, but now that I'm not going into a gym right now, not yet. I'm just not.
Good choice.
Yes, I think so too. So when it comes to like the day, obviously the school day dominates my life. And that's one thing we also were talking about before we started recording. Time is my most precious commodity, both in terms of myself and as well as the time that I have to work on what I'm doing with my students, the time I have with my students, because especially right now, I only have them in person live with me for 2 hours a week via Zoom. So trying to really maximize that. And then lately too, my evenings are also all about my classes, what I need to do, what I need to make, what, you know, everything from digital recordings to assessment to all that until the end. And so my own personal game designs are kind of on hold right now because approaching school is basically taken over the focus. But even so, I have such a game-based, play-based approach to what I want to do. I mean, if I can do something really straightforward, or I can figure out the more fun way to do it. And I've always been like that as a teacher. What is the most fun way we could learn about this? And so it's a really fun challenge right now in a lot of ways to embrace the limitations that we have in terms of remote learning, but to also turn that around and to do work with my students that I never could have done with them before. But because we have all this technology and connectivity, how I can best make use of it. So my night usually ends with, I really like bourbon. it's, it's some days. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I mean, I love what I do, and it's such a part of who I am, and my passion for the kids and what I can have them create is just drives me so much in what I do. And it's fun for me too. I mean, I love a challenge. I love a problem to solve. And so I hope that my students see that with what I'm doing with them too.
Absolutely. That sounds like a very passionate and exciting way to approach your days, your weeks, and everything in between, Kathleen. So now that we've gotten into the subject and all those fantastic things that you're doing, there is something that we always argue that is important, and it's about learning from failure and those difficult moments that we have when things don't go our way, where you're going north and things go south. So we would like to know of a story of one of those times when you were, trying to do something and arrived at that fail or first attempt in learning. And how did it go? How did you get out of it? Or what did you learn from it? Take us into that story. We want to be there with you.
Well, it's funny. I mean, one, I fail every day, every single day. But I read
maybe your favorite story of that.
Yeah, right. Well, but I read something last week, and it was something that a pessimist sees an obstacle as failure, and an optimist sees it as opportunity. And that's so true for me, especially as far as being the optimist, especially with, like I've described before, with all that. So a couple years ago, I was presenting at Tabletop Network, their first game designer retreat. It was held out in Utah. And I was one of the speakers. And so I was to present on the second day. And the first day, so many of the presenters were talking about game design in all aspects. And literally, I'm sitting there like basically mentally deleting slides from my slide deck in terms of what it was going to cover. And I was like, cool, this is very cool. This is super cool. This is great. But then I was thinking, like, what is it that I do that I can talk about? Because I had the game signed at that point, nothing on the shelf. So to talk, there were people there who had never even started designing a game, but still, what can I talk about that all of these well-known, established, long-time designers haven't talked about with everybody? And the thing that I landed on was I can talk about failure. Because so often when we talk about game design, it's all of like these sort of like abstract things in terms of, I mean, obviously, and sometimes practical too, in terms of what you need to do in order to be successful. But we never talk about failure. We never talk about the moments where you decide something's not working, the moment where your brain just stalls out. Because when I teach game design to 7th grade students, I have students in that class who don't like games. They don't necessarily want to design a game. They don't necessarily even like designing games as much as I try to do. It's just not for them. And so when I deal with failure, especially for my students, like the frustration, everything, especially considering they're in 7th grade, it is real, it is palpable, it is projected. And so I think looking at how we approach a problem and the solutions we take to it, I think dealing with failure and being able to talk about failure and how my students struggle and the lessons and advice they had that I'd collected from them for designers. And that's what I pretty much talked about, was looking at failure as not necessarily the obstacle, but as that opportunity. And it went over really, really well. I was really happy because I was the only person who sort of talked about that. And, especially for my students who are gifted kids, who are used to being successful in school, are used to getting an assignment, doing it, turning it in, moving on to the next thing. Game design means they create something bad, and then they have to try to make it better, and that failure can be right there on the table in front of them. You can't hide behind words on a paper, So hopefully the thing that I want more from my students in terms of pushing failure at them constantly, I want them to leave my class thinking someone can give me some type of weirdo challenge and I can do it. And I can probably come up with something. That's the whole reason and the whole point, to shift their mindset from seeing, failure as an obstacle to embracing it as an opportunity.
Absolutely. That sounds super exciting. And I'm a bit surprised in a place where all these people are doing games and playtesting. And playtesting is all about failure, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, when you do playtesting, it's about finding out what you did wrong. Like it's the normal thing that you get. Of course, when it's students, when it's kids, especially, frustration comes in many different ways. And there's so many things to handle from that point of view. But, I would rather argue that that should be one of the main topics in a place like that one. But it's interesting that you brought that up and how you were able also to spin it around and see what were the lessons that you brought from your students as well. So I love your story.
Oh, thanks. Well, and I think too, when we're designing games and you get a game on the table to playtest, that's a success. There's no question. It could be the worst playtest ever, but you put it on the table, because the difference between a finished game and one that's not is perseverance. You have to be willing to get negative feedback. You have to be willing to incorporate it. You have to try to figure out what's the best approach. You have to listen to your own voice. You have to listen to your play testers, all those different things. But there's so many people who might get a game on the table. They might have it in their head, but do they actually do it? And that's a whole other level to overcome. And then in terms of getting feedback, there are people who they don't like the feedback. They don't like the process of getting feedback. They don't like hearing negative things. And then their game stalls out there as well. So I think especially when people are used to getting games on the table, they're, the failure aspect of it it's not actually failure. It's more information. It's more information about making something better. And so it's those stalling moments where you just stop. Like, forward movement is better than nothing at all. And that's what I think I'm trying to convey to my students.
Absolutely. And how to pivot from that situation of apparent failure. And that's why one of the things that we like to talk about in that sense. And now I'd like to shift, failure might be the initial step, it might be the second step, the third, the fifth, or the 10th. But at some point, usually you get to some sort of success if you keep pushing, as you said. So we want to, know everything about his story, because here we talked about his success as well, but we want to know of his story of actual just success. Like, how did that go? Something that you're proud of, and you can say, well, this was the project that I did and I went for, and it actually went out well using, game design, using a game in your classroom, whatever you want to go for.
Oh, gosh.
You can have that proud moment. That's also allowed.
Well, one of my favorite things is when I got my game, what's now called Dragnarok. It was then called Dirty Birdie. And someone I know in the industry, Travis Chance, who was starting Colossal Games, and he's now since moved on, but he was looking for big, splashy, Kickstarter-friendly things. I messaged him. I said, hey, I've got one for you. And this is a game that had sat on the shelf for 2 years because I'd shown it to a whole number of publishers. They're like, it's hilarious. It's unique. There's nothing out there like it. And this would be just too expensive for us to make. So for Travis, when I put the game on the table and we were playtesting it, and he just looked up at me with this look in his eyes, and we're friends. And he just looked at me, he's like, God damn it, Kathleen. I said, I know. It's good. I know. So that was like that begrudging sense of doom in his eyes when he realized that a good game was on the table. That was what he was looking for, even if it wasn't what he expected, so that was pretty hilarious, and I think if there's anything for others to gain from that experience is if you have a weird idea, make it, because you never know.
You never know who's going to bring it forward and push it into the future.
Well, and actually, the funny thing about that prototype was because it was such a unique, different game we ran it at BGG's speed dating event and stuff like that. There are people who remembered me because of that game. Like when the playtesting event was over, everyone was gathered around my table, and different publishers were explaining to other people, this is what this game is, and this is how you play it. I mean, so it got a really huge response. But also in terms of talking about myself to other people, I'm a game designer, I'm working on it. They're like, oh, what do you have? I said, well, I've got one game called Dirty Birdie. And I remember the late James Matthew looked at me. We were talking. He's like, I've heard of that. I said, yeah, that was my game. So it was a really great sort of resume builder in some ways in terms of sort of creating an identity for myself as a designer a little bit out there. Now, having just that as a prototype in the end, it's all about getting your name on a box, your box on the shelf. And luckily there's more movement on that happening too. But that was pretty fun.
Absolutely. It sounds like a lot of fun. And we've been talking about your classes in game design, your talks in game design. You've shown some of your success here. And I'm sure that you have many ways of approaching this. And of course, you're teaching it as well. So when you're telling somebody how to design a game, especially, I know you're not into, sort of game-based learning necessarily, or gamification, but when you're going to create a game, when you're going to create one of these experiences, do you have some sort of process, series of steps? How do you do your brainstorming? I don't know. How does that look like when you teach it to somebody else? What does game design look like for doing that, or creating a game for your class as well?
Sure. I mean, design thinking is really something that I've assimilated so much. And honestly, in teaching this to my students, I've really assimilated a lot of the sort of design thinking mindsets. I use Stanford University's D School, a lot of their resources, and especially their approaches, like their when it comes to like design mindsets, like I'm talking about, there's just very ideas like radical collaboration. You want to have as many different people, give feedback. You want to show unfinished work. But one of the most important ones is what's called bias towards action. And that's the idea that you could sit there and think about it, or you could just start doing it. And for me, that's been probably one of the most important aspects, because remember, we talked about inertia before, and just not doing anything. Bias towards action means just start doing the thing. And as you start doing it, you're thinking as you're doing it. So you don't get lost in your head in terms of creating this sort of like perfect abstract idea of what something is. And so for me, when it comes to even like how I'm constructing what I'm doing, I just start working on it, So right now I'm teaching film to my 8th graders because it's something that I can do with them at home with their iPads. But even my approach to it is totally different. And so when it comes to any type of design work, and the design process is universal for anything that you want to make, but the thing that's most important that stands out to me as far as the Stanford model goes is it starts with empathy and understanding the needs of your user. So as a teacher, this is critically important in order to be successful, but also when I'm, but just even for the work itself and wanting them, to also, I teach using design thinking to my students to also learn design thinking. So there's just like all these sorts of layers and levels as it goes with this. But
layers upon layers upon layers.
But it's so good, it's so good because it's so universal. They could apply this, sort of approach everything like, but what do they need? What would be helpful for them? And especially when you're talking about like, I try to do as little telling my students, but as much showing them and as much demonstration for them too. So small example, in the past when I've taught film, we're in the class and there's this, I do very little lectures, but I've got this one PowerPoint of like, honestly, 200 slides, but it's all screenshots of various films. And I'm talking about composition. I'm talking about camera distances, camera angles, and how you use the camera to tell a story. And so for my students, I don't want to just lecture them for an hour straight via Zoom, and they don't want me to lecture them for an hour straight over Zoom. So just coming up with completely different ways to make them more active in terms of like learning on their own. So for example, I'm having over the summer, lots of people were on Instagram recreating famous artworks using, things that they had from their house. So I took that idea. So now they're recreating scenes from famous movies, which is hilarious. I've seen the pictures of what they're coming up with, and I was crying over this one kid's like retelling of Lion King. But also in doing this, then here's these resources and go and find out like, what's the camera angle here? What's the distance here? What's composition, techniques are you using when you come up with the shot? So it's, kind of taking something that's organic and authentic for them to recreate this movie scene, something that's really fun, but then having them learn how they constructed the image like after, they'd already put it together, So as far as like just thinking like a designer, understanding the needs of my user and all of the materials, the liabilities, time, all those different things really comes into play whenever I'm doing anything for my students.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. That design thinking is something that is very akin to game design, to, I have to say, gamification design as well. And I would say that all these disciplines that imply, a certain level of empathy, because one of the things that gamification gets openly criticized about is when those people start doing sort of just leaderboards, points and badges.
Right.
And when you just do that, you're not thinking who's in there. Maybe the solution includes that or is just that. But if you don't start from a point of empathy, as you were saying, it's hardly going to have any sort of success.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then I think that just, if you don't know who you're teaching, how can you teach to them? It just fundamentally boggles my mind. So I mean, there are certain things that might be sort of universal knowledge, I guess, when it comes to teaching. Like, I know I'm going to teach this. This is how I taught it last year. It seemed to go okay. But how would it be different if you could know more about your students and where they're at when they come in? And I know this is like Education 101 in theory, but there's even so many things this year when we went back to school and we had a whole week of meetings and trainings and stuff like that. And there are times I was sitting there going, they didn't ask a single teacher about what we needed when we came back to work, because the session that we're in right now is such a mismatch, I think, for what I need and probably for other people and what they need, but they didn't approach it like that. They approach it from this different perspective. And that can be really, really frustrating when you feel like your time could be better served elsewhere. And I never want my students to feel like I'm just giving them busy work to do.
There's this author and speaker and consultant as well called Yu-Kai Chow. I don't know if you've heard of him. Mm-hmm. He likes to say that these things are function-focused design. When you're thinking, well, what do you have to make it do? And it could be a person, it could be anything. Mm-hmm. And then there's human-focused design, right? Not just centered, but focused. So you're thinking not only of what it has to achieve, but who has to achieve it, who is going to be the user, who's going to be doing it. So that shift in the focus of not just thinking, oh, we have to get the people in this classroom, so we need these many seats, not just of the function, which is important, but it's not the only thing. You also think of the people who are behind it, the humans that are going to be there, their motivations, their needs, and so on. And shifting that attention to that, I think, is crucial, and it's very important. At least that was one of the first places where I heard that. So I wanted to reference my friend Yu-Kai as well.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's @RobAlvarezB and hashtag Professor Game, all one word. And in Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. So Kathleen, when we're talking about game design, when we're talking about, using games in the classroom or teaching game design as well, is there any sort of, I don't know, we can always call it a best practice. I don't want to say it's a silver bullet, but one of those things that you do and it's probably going to help you in your design. It's going to help you, have a better, final product, let's call it.
Well, so for me, my final product is wanting my students to feel successful at the end of class and to feel like they've developed a skill set to take on challenges and to be successful. And one thing that I struggled with, especially for a long time, was I would have kids leave my class feeling like they did a lot of work, but they didn't like their game. And if they didn't like their game, then it was really hard for them to look back on the whole experience positively. And that's really hard for me personally, professionally, because I see success in incremental progress. They don't necessarily see it the same way. It's the biggest project they've ever had in school. It's hard. So one of my things, and this took me a long time, I was like, the idea started kind of popping in my head. But, especially when you teach something for one semester, then the school year is over, you start thinking about, whatever summer opportunities I'm doing. I was thinking about like the fall and, that. And so then game design would come back around and really wanting to, it was almost too late to sort of make the changes that I wanted to. And so I started to this past semester say, nope, there are things I want to do differently, and I'm going to do this now. And then we got shut down. So I didn't really get to see this all fully fleshed out. But I was then asked to teach an online game design class this summer, and I was able to make the changes. So basically, when I have students design games, I have them play a lot of games, and then I have them design a race game, a small, simple game using mechanics from the games that they had played in class. Because when you're wanting to teach kids how to design games, if you don't broaden their gaming literacy in terms of game mechanics and other just styles of play, objectives, everything, they will only recreate what they know, which is why if you Google make a board game, almost every single image that pops up in the top however many will look like Candyland, Monopoly, etc., because that's what they know. So you have to give kids more gaming literacy, basically, by playing a lot more games to design games. And then after that, then we would start working on their main project. Because one of the big things, especially with game design or just design in general, is you want it to be iterative, right? Take the idea, get feedback, make changes to it. Take the idea, play test it, get feedback, etc. And the problem that I had, especially when kids are working on the one big game, was that they would not like it and they would go tired of it. And so when it was like get feedback, make changes, a lot of times they kind of had dug themselves into sort of a design hole. And they couldn't really make the changes that they needed to do without a lot more time, individual guidance from me, things that we didn't necessarily have as much as I wanted. And so what I decided to do was, instead of having kids design a very small game and a big game, I would instead have them design 5 small games, or at least multiple small games, multiple different challenges. And this was really influenced by one of my good friends, John Brieger, who's a professional game developer and who studied design at the collegiate level. And he told me about this one professor that he had who had 2 different classes. He had one class design 2 things and spend a lot of time on them. He had the other class design multiple things and not give them a lot of time on them. And what he found was they became much better designers, the class that did multiple things, even though they hadn't spent as much time like really developing their ideas. But because they had, proceeded through this design process multiple times with a freshness that came from new ideas, that was what I took as my inspiration for this. So this summer, I did this online game class, and each week I had to push out new content. And by the way, it's from Bennett Live. It's a private day school in Chicago. Bennett Day School is the school in Chicago. It's called Bennett Live, and they're still running all this school year. And so you can go there, and it's free. You can have access to all those resources, and you can have kids do it, or if you do it, whatever you like. But anyway, so each week I had to put out a new design challenge. So every week I talked about something with design, and then there was a game design challenge that connected to that. And so this idea that I had for what I wanted to do over the summer or for over the semester, I basically redesigned my whole curriculum in terms of how I'm going to do it in the future because of this summer class. So it was great. Like, they were paying me to teach this online class, but I was like, ha, 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 you're actually paying me to redesign my whole curriculum the way I wanted to. And so there's 5 different game design challenges that go with the 5 different components. And so moving forward, this is what I will do. And so the big shift for me was, instead of having kids focus on 2 things, giving them a lot of different challenges, because at the end, there's probably something they like in each of the games. We don't spend so much time on them where they can't really get that deep entrenched sense of failure. But instead, every single game is probably at a point of a lot of opportunity at that point. And if they want to keep working on them, that's great. I'm happy to support them in any way they can. But wanting to give them a whole bunch of different challenges so there just isn't that ongoing fatigue.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I can relate to that very much. I even with the short workshop I did with not kids, actually with professors, university and executive level professors as well. It was 10 days long, and it was just one thing that they were creating. And of course, the iteration was very, very short. It was like, oh, but it's like such a big thing and so on. It's like, oh, but it's just 10 days. You don't have that much time to dedicate to it anyway. But I can relate to that frustration. I can remember some of the people talking about that as well.
Yeah, it's hard to be creative on a time frame like that, to like come up with your idea right now, boom, do it. So at least if one idea isn't so great, then you can move on to something else, or maybe the new piece that I'm teaching actually will help you take that other idea and be like, you know what, I want to take this, but I want to apply this to it now, So it's all there. It's all their games. So I'm just trying to fill up their little box.
Absolutely. And we're talking about recommendations. So you gave your first one, that best practice that you're talking about, both, having all these mechanics, broaden their game design. If you want to be a writer, you have to write, of course, if you want to be a writer, but you also have to read. So you sort of get all these tools. So it's kind of a similar to that. And you were talking then as well about this sort of breaking up things when people are doing not just one big, huge design, especially with the frustration that can generate. And you were talking about those recommendations. And I would also like to know if there's, when you've been hearing this conversation, these questions, is there anybody that comes to your mind that you would say, oh, this person would be great. I'd like to listen to the answer of this or that person. And again, that's an open question. Anybody can be good.
Oh, sure. I mean, there's so many good people out there. I really love Senfung Lim, who is a game designer with a lot of different titles, but he also teaches psychology at the university level in Canada. And so his understanding both of, design from a personal standpoint, but as well as like what we were talking about with failure and like the human aspects of design. And especially one other thing too that's really interesting is there's been a lot of movement in terms of social justice issues in a very good way, I would say. And for him, especially talking about representation in games and how we look at what our games are presenting and how we handle different cultures. He has an RPG that's all about Chinese restaurants, and he and his co-author on this RPG, they're both Chinese, of Chinese origin, but they still consulted with people who are native to China now, as far as to make sure that everything was accurate, or that they, that they got it right. So even being, I'm not sure if both of them are Chinese Canadian, but either way, so I think that another really interesting, good perspective when it comes to looking at game design, gamification, or just game design, I would say. When it comes to like gamification itself and how best to gamify, I'll need to think on that a little bit more as far as who, but Sen is always someone who's so good to talk to when it comes to games and game design.
Absolutely. Sounds like a very exciting guest to have here. And you've talked about this person. Is there any book, and again, an audience like this one who's thinking maybe for the first time, or is, has some experience as well, a book that you would recommend for an audience like this one, somebody who's thinking about engaging their audience in some way? Again, it could be in the classroom, it could be for other purposes. What would you like? Is there anything that you would say this is a good resource to start guiding them or to get them somewhere?
Well, the two books that I recommend the most as it relates to game design in particular, especially wanting to teach game design, since that's my big push. There's two. There's the Kobold Guide to Game Design, edited by Mike Selinger, who has worked in so many different forms of games and so many companies, from D&D and World of Warcraft and all kinds of other things, Magic the Gathering, I think, too. I'm probably even making up credits, but basically, like any big name, he's basically done it. But it's a really great, slim volume with sort of like a chronological approach to game design, everything from generating ideas all the way through to the end to like getting things published. And that's a great one. The other really excellent book that I recommend for teachers, if there's any two books you're going to have, if you want to teach game design, at least when you're getting started, the first is the Kobold Guide, because like I said about game design, but the second is Challenges for Game Designers by Ian Schreiber and Brenda Braithwaite, because that book breaks down games and game design from a different approach. You're talking more like from like an aesthetic approach, or you might be talking about, certain aspects that you might only really find in a video game. The book was developed for people who teach video game design, but want to use tabletop game design techniques in order to teach video game design. So basically you can learn good design fundamentals because it's much easier to iterate using a paper prototype. But the nice thing about that one is there are so many different types of challenges and exercises that as teachers you can use to convey, to get kids to actually start doing the thing that you're talking about, as opposed to just telling them, here's this thing you need to know how to do. And I did think of one other guest too. He's also a Canadian, also works with Sen, part of the Bamboozle Brothers, is Jay Cormier. And Jay is also a game designer and teaches game design through a video game. Through a video game design program. And it's actually an extension of a film school in Canada. So there's a heavy, the emphasis on narrative that makes sense as it relates to video games. But he's someone else who also understands teaching game design, designing games, and from that different perspective of more of a video game narrative, sort of heavy basis for it. So Jay Cormier is someone else I'd recommend for you.
Absolutely great books and great recommendations from possible guests as well. And what would you say, I know this is a difficult question, you probably play a lot of games as well, so what would you say is your favorite game?
Well, I was on the podcast once called 5 Games for Doomsday, and it was a really interesting podcast because what are the 5 games that you would save if there's something apocalyptic going on? And let's not look out the window too hard on that one right now, but but it really made me think about what games I would want to save. And so my 5 were my favorite game of all time, which is Iron Dragon. It just scratches a very particular itch in terms of like planning. It's honestly like multiplayer solitaire, but I love that game. I also love the game Survive, Escape from Atlantis. It's my favorite game from a design standpoint. If my game can hit a lot of the notes that game hits for me, then I will consider my design to be a success. I also wanted to save Catan because I think it's I love Catan, but I also think it's too important of a game in the pantheon of modern board gaming not to save. I also saved Le Havre as it was my first favorite heavy-ish kind of Euro game for me to play. And then finally, the last game that I saved is Eat Poop You Cat, my absolute favorite late night game convention party game where all we're trying to do is make each other laugh as much as we can. And those are some of my favorite moments from all of game conventions, of when we just get, pen and paper and just start being super silly.
Absolutely. And what would you say is your sort of your superpower in this area, that sweet spot where you feel that you're at least better than most?
I come up with a lot of bad ideas. A lot of bad ideas.
Absolutely.
A lot of bad ideas. So many bad ideas. But tying this back to where we started from, looking at it as opportunities, not as failure. And so if I have something bad, I know I can work with it and to turn it into something that's probably okay.
And from that, you go to good, and then from that to great.
Exactly.
So, absolutely.
Exactly. Like, you got to get messy. You got to just get in there. But it's fun.
You got to do what you got to do. Absolutely. And Kathleen, before we take off, because we're running out of time, I would like to know if you have any sort of final piece of advice for the engagers. Please let us know where we can find you. I know you have a fantastic webpage full of resources. And before you finish that as well, I would like to know very, very quickly, what does teaching cosplay look like very, very quickly?
Oh, I love it. So cosplay, if people aren't familiar with it, it's the intersection of like a fandom and Halloween. And so a lot of my parents are sort of like confused by me doing this. But once I start to explain that it's really about project management and the development of kids to learn all these independent skills to make their costumes. So when I'm doing cosplay, my whole classroom is taken over by cardboard boxes, because they have to keep their supplies in boxes. Cardboard boxes full of their materials. I've got sewing machines, glue guns. If there's anything big they want to do, like fiberglass, whatever, any kind of big fabrication, we have to use the industrial tech room, or they have to do that at home. But basically, kids are in class trying to figure out how they can build the costume of their dreams. And that class, kids will work harder for that than anything else I ever asked them to do. Because when you give kids the opportunity to be the character that they love more than anything, they will do anything and everything they need to do to make it come to life. So teaching cosplay is bananas great. There's one other thing I would recommend. One of my favorite things on the internet, it's on YouTube by a guy named Jake Palmer. It's a 1 minute, 22-second video called Finished Not Perfect. And I show that to students all the time in pretty much any class. But basically, the gist of it is the world needs artists who finish things. And you're going to just get out. If you want to learn how to do something, get out there and do it. And if you hate something now, that's okay, because you're going to keep going and you're naturally going to get better. So don't worry about something being perfect. Just worry about it getting finished so that you can move on to the next project. And that's another really important thing, I think, for us, especially for myself, because I tend to be very much a perfectionist, and learning how to basically stop and move forward when I'm working on something it's a thing that, we all probably struggle with, but it's a really good external sort of framework in which to think about it. So I always recommend people do that, and I tell my students, I want you to be creators, not just consumers. And I would rather you create something bad than read, or show me something that someone else did that was great.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's also a great recommendation. Kathleen, where can we find you? Where can we see all those resources? Because that's where I found out about your cosplay class.
Oh, yeah.
And so much more.
Yeah. So I'm at KathleenMercury.com. You can message me directly through there. I'm on Twitter at Mercury with 7 M's. I don't post on there too much. I probably should do more, but we always have so many things pulling at us. So yeah, those are the two best places to get a hold of me. And I really, really do love collaborating, helping people. So if someone wants to teach game design, if they've got questions, shoot me an email. I'm happy to set up some time where we can just sort of talk about what you want to do, how you want to do it, how I might suggest you frame your class. And because the more we have kids creating things, then just think about all the amazing solutions that they'll be able to come up with for any number of real world problems that we have.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your time, for your investment, because as we've said, our time is one of the most valuable assets. So investing that time here and today with the engagers in this podcast, sharing your knowledge with so many people that will listen to this and enjoy it and profit from that. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Kathleen. I'd like to know if you have any questions that you'd like to make sure future guests answer for you. If you do, go to professorgame.com/question and ask your own question. And if it is selected, it will come up in a future episode and you will get your answer live here on Professor Game. And before you go on to your next mission, remember to subscribe using your favorite podcast app to listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.